All right, hey, wrong slide. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Chapter 9 video. So we're on to Chapter 9 and just one section of Chapter 10 for this week. So the reading load is a little bit lighter. Chapter 9 covers the topic of economic growth. So that is something you hear a lot of talk about. Everybody wants economic growth. Everybody's very interested in how you promote it. But first, I guess we should mostly just understand exactly what it is and what that really means. A lot of this chapter is pretty self-explanatory and easy to read. So, there's some good stuff at the beginning about the benefits that have been brought by economic growth, that sort of thing. So I'll leave you to read that stuff. I'm not going to really talk about it. But let's start here. Before we really get into the meat of the chapter, the graph that's on the left of your screen there shows economic growth as measured by U.S. real GDP over time. So it's going all the way back to 1930, starting right at the beginning of the Great Depression, and then showing real GDP up until almost the current time. So you can see that there's some little squiggly ups and downs in the line, but the long-term general trend has definitely been one of upward GDP, which means economic growth. So that's a good thing. On the right, the smaller graph, you can see the green line. That's sort of the trend line of economic growth. And then the yellow line shows these little ups and downs of the business cycle. So that's pretty typical. The business cycle tends to happen regularly. We can't always predict exactly when things are going to go up or down, but we get these peaks and troughs. We get growth periods and recession periods, but the long-term trend has been upward for many, many, many years in our country, and that's a good thing. I've got a note over there to relate this to Keynes versus the classical economists. If you remember that chapter that we read a couple chapters ago where they talked about all these different economic viewpoints, the classical economists tend to focus on the long term, and they would look at this and say, look, the long-term trend is good. In the long term, the economy will fix itself and we will grow and we'll be fine. And they use that to argue that the government should just stay out of the economy, stay out of the way, and kind of let the economy take care of itself. You might remember my favorite quote from Keynes. Keynes once said, well, in the long run, we're all dead. Meaning, yeah, it's probably true that in the long run, the economy might fix itself, but in the short run, a lot of people are suffering, they're unemployed, they can't feed their families, they're struggling, they're starving. These are real problems that maybe the government should deal with. So, it's just a difference between if you look at that long-term trend and say the government should do nothing, or you do like Keynes and look at the ups and downs of the yellow curve there and understand, look back at the Great Depression there. There's a good 10 or 12-year period where we were in this horrible depression. Lots of people were unemployed. Imagine being unemployed for 12 years out of your working career. That would be pretty devastating. So Keynes would argue that we need the government to help us out in situations like that. Okay, anyway, back to the chapter. Well, not yet, I guess. A little more data here. The graph here shows you resident population of Maine in black, which you can see it's actually a growth rate there. So the highest it gets is not even 1%, drops down to pretty close to zero. So the population of Maine is basically staying the same. It's not really changing much at all. Real GDP is shown in the red line, so it was pretty high. This is showing you the period of the Great Recession recently, so it drops down to negative territory and it's pretty low, but it's on its way back up now. I think this graph doesn't quite come up to 2019. And then employment is in blue. That one kind of tracks GDP, as you can see. A couple stats over on the left, but if you pay attention, you hear a lot of talk about the Maine economy and how it's not the best, it's not great, and it isn't. It's a little worse off than the U.S. economy on average. But I guess the good thing that I'll say is that when the U.S. economy booms really high, Maine doesn't boom quite as high. But that means that when the economy sinks really low and we have a recession, Maine doesn't sink as low either. So our business cycles are a little smoother, a little less dramatic. So that's kind of a good thing. Also, the fact that GDP is growing kind of slowly doesn't sound that great, but if our population is basically stable, then a growing GDP means more GDP per capita. So the news is not all bad for me. Okay, so this is out of the book. One of the key things to understand is this idea of the aggregate production function. And key assumption there is that this assumes that capital, natural resources, and technology are constant. So if we assume those things are changed, what this graph shows you is a relationship between employment, like the number of actual people working, and real GDP. So it should make sense that there's a positive slope because more workers means we're going to produce more stuff. But I think the other important thing here is notice that it's increasing, but at a decreasing rate. It's kind of starting to flatten off. And that goes back to that first assumption. If capital, natural resources, and technology are unchanged, then just adding more and more workers at some point begins to get less and less efficient because, if you've only got 3 trucks, 3 drivers can drive 3 trucks. If you hire more drivers, doesn't really help you much if you don't add more capital in the form of trucks. So in most work settings, just adding more labor can't alone increase production at some point. You've got to add more of those other things too. So that's the reason the aggregate production function has that slope that it does. And this idea that I just explained is known as the idea of diminishing marginal returns to labor. That means that adding more workers adds a certain amount to your GDP, but as you add more and more workers, the additional benefit kind of diminishes. It gets smaller and smaller. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, another graph right out of the book. And I think in one of the exercises for these chapters, I ask you to kind of relate to these 3 things. So all these graphs are interrelated. So on the left, you have the labor market. In the labor market, the supply of labor are the workers themselves. The demand are businesses trying to hire workers. So at the intersection of S1 and D1, you've got an equilibrium in the labor market where the real wage is W1 and L1 is the quantity of workers employed. At that point, you look over to the middle graph, that's the aggregate production function. We're along PF1 with real GDP of Y1 and the same amount of labor, L1. That correlates to the long run aggregate supply curve, LRAS1. The long run aggregate supply curve is also called the potential output because it's what an economy can produce if we're at full employment. So if we're at equilibrium in the labor market, that's full employment. Therefore, we're at our potential output of LRAS1 on the right. In this example from the book, an improvement in technology shifts the aggregate production function upward. So the middle graph shifts from PF1 to PF2 due to an improvement in technology making us more efficient. This then increases the demand for labor because if we're producing more stuff, businesses need more workers. So D1 shifts up to D2, raising the real wage and the quantity employed. And that also increases what the economy can produce. So the long run aggregate supply curve shifts out to the right. So that's kind of the relationship between those 3 curves or graphs. Okay, I think I'm almost done here. I just can't help but point out that the book talks a little bit about the OECD recommendations. OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international group of economists from all over the world who work on, trying to grow better economies all around the world. And I won't read these to you, but the 5 things on the screen there are the things that they've been recommending that we do in the United States for quite a few years. I'll let you slowly read through those. Those are probably all things that you've heard of. They are things that get talked about all the time. We need to do these things. Everyone agrees, but for some reason we don't do them. To quote the book, the U.S. stands out as a country having shown neither responsiveness nor follow through on addressing these things. So it's kind of strange and disturbing. All right, so I think that's it. Just one more bonus point opportunity. If you're watching this video, you see my garage in the background. That is my summer home project, just painting the garage. So text or email me that for a bonus point, or as I said, come help for lots of bonus points. Not really, I wouldn't ask you to do that. Okay, that's it for chapter 9. Thanks. See ya.